My name is Vern Hoven.
And I'm Sharon Kreider. We're here in Western CPE's studio in beautiful Bozeman, Montana. And we have a guest today with us who's going to talk about President Trump's tax plan, and we have a few questions for her. So, Karen Brosi is our guest. She is a tax practitioner in Silicon Valley with very high net worth clients, high income, high net worth, because her neighbors are Apple, Google, Facebook, and a variety of names that we might not have at the tip of our tongue, like those particular ones. So you know Karen from perhaps the IRS forums. She has done that for several years. You know her from AICPA Engage, which she and I have done together for the last several years. And then, of course, she stars in the Western CPE sponsored federal California tax update classes, which we have done for a really, really long time, Ms. Brosi. So that's our guest. And Vern, you're going to start with some questions for Karen.
So, Karen, what are President Trump's key tax policies?
Well, Vern, when it comes to the president and his current reelection campaign, the most interesting thing about tax policy has been that the conversation's been rather light, is I guess the way I'll put it, in that both the president and the Republican controlled Congress have remained very, very pleased with themselves over the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from December of 2017. And as far as they're concerned, overall, that has been the answer to tax law. And so predominantly, when you ask the Trump campaign or when you look at their literature about what would the president's ongoing tax policy be, in almost every area, it focuses on maintaining the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017. And in several of those areas, because as you know, many of those provisions were temporary and set to expire. So in several of those areas, the further policy is about turning those soon to be expiring provisions into permanent provisions. And so on the individual side, really about the only couple of things that we're looking at in terms of changes, there has been a little bit of discussion in the Trump campaign about capital gains rates. And for the president right now, what he would do is he would say, let's lower the highest capital gain rate. So let's eliminate the 20% capital gain rate, top capital gains at 15% as a maximum capital gain rate. And then in addition to that, there has been some discussion about indexing basis for inflation. So basically they say indexing capital gains, but what they really mean about that is indexing basis for inflation, which would reduce the actual overall capital gain calculation that would be subject to tax. That one has probably not received as much traction or as much discussion as it could, mostly because this is a discussion among us, among tax people. And can you imagine the nightmare? Because first of all, sure, I can get, if you tell me, here's your inflation rate from this date of acquisition, just adjust your basis by this amount. Except that presupposes I know two things: date of acquisition and actual original basis, which you and I know is not always the simple answer with our clients. So that can be a little bit problematic. There's been some discussion in the Trump campaign about expanding a few credits, in particular, a credit for donations to private school scholarship plans. So there's donations there would generate some form of a credit. So there's been a little bit of discussion about that. There's also on the individual side, on the area of other credits, there's been some discussion about limiting a taxpayer's ability to take a credit in, to those taxpayers who have a valid for work social security number. Otherwise, we have implemented that a child, et cetera, or a dependent may not qualify you for some credits if they don't have a social security number, only have a TIN. This sort of flips that switch a little bit and says the taxpayer themselves may not qualify for the credit if they don't have a valid for work social security number. And then beyond that, in terms of individual rates or individual changes, that's kind of about it. On the business side, not much, but emphasis on expanding the expanding the or extending rather the bonus depreciation amounts. So, because as many of us know, those bonus depreciations, that 100% bonus depreciation, is supposed to start ratcheting down after 2022, and then it's supposed to end up going away by 2020, after 2026. And so there's been some discussion about extending bonus depreciation out beyond those thresholds and those deadlines. There has been some discussion about the possibility of a change in corporate rate, but nothing of any kind of definitive number has been attached to that. But maybe just, it's more like, yeah, we could talk about the corporate rate.
Karen, are you
The
talking
rate on
about
corporations.
President Trump saying increase the rate or lower it further?
In potentially increase the rate, but we just don't know if there's a number attached to that or not. In fact, there hasn't been a number attached to that or not. And then, of course, one of the things that we are struggling with is this whole thing about delay in payroll tax, and the payment of, or the accrual of, and the payment of payroll taxes. And of course, under executive order, and could that be expanded and pushed farther along? All of these are mostly designed to talk about individual changes. And so, for businesses, just more of the same, just expand or make permanent, or continue and make permanent. For individuals, continue and make permanent some of the changes from TCJA. So, other than that, we don't have a real hard and fast focus on, are there details. It's not as detailed a plan, I guess is what I would say, as the Biden plan, because the answer is there was a very detailed plan that was actually enacted in December of 2017, and that's the plan that they want to continue to go with and build their budget, or their fiscal year budgets around. So, Vern, that's what I think is current in the Trump campaign tax plan.
Thank you. Now I've got a second question. As the deficit increases, will President Trump have the support needed to make his tax changes permanent?
Well, and that, of course, is an entirely different political question, as we all know. So, first of all, we all know that without Republican support in both the House and the Senate, that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would not have occurred in the way that it did. It's very clear, particularly by the closeness in the Senate in that regard, that is a bill that would not have occurred. And it was a bill that was passed predominantly along partisan lines. So if that is the reaction, that was the reaction then to the Trump tax plan, then if the current Trump or the ongoing President Trump tax plan is more of the same. I think it is dependent, entirely dependent upon partisan politics in order to sustain itself. Now, does that mean that if the president loses control, or if the Republicans, let me put it that way, if the Republicans lose control of either the House or the Senate or both in some ways, does that mean that none of the president's proposals can go forward? And I think that there are just a couple of items that do have some bipartisan support in there. Everybody likes to talk about eliminating carried interest. Most people like to talk about continuing certain credits, particularly those credits that would expand the economy, that would help support businesses, and businesses continuing, and businesses creating jobs, and businesses generating revenue that would increase the tax base. So I think those are the kinds of things that could receive bipartisan support. But blanket, in light of the deficits that we're looking at right now, blanket overall extension, that's the word, extension, or elimination of any kind of rollback or sunset provisions, I think that requires partisan support. It won't receive wide nonpartisan support.
And I believe we'll only have bipartisan support if we continue with our system of horse trading. You know, if you give me this, I'll give you that, may be why we get any bipartisan support for either President Trump's reelection or Vice President Biden's success. Karen, how will President Trump pay for COVID-19? You know, I think we've put $3 trillion onto our deficit in COVID relief, and as we, I think, all agree that we needed into our economy. I shared with you earlier, Karen, a PwC survey that says when they surveyed their Fortune 500 clients, 70% of the CFOs believe corporate tax rate will increase to pay for some of this COVID relief, regardless who wins. So I have a couple of questions. Number one, do you think President Trump will suggest raising taxes? And number two, I wonder what you would guess President Trump and Congress could do if we went into a recession. You and I know, or we know, that 31 million people have collected unemployment during the year. And I read a statistic that 1 out of 6 small businesses closed permanently because of all of the COVID shutdowns, slowdowns, cautions, everything else. So that's sort of my wrap-up question on what you think about paying for COVID.
Well, as you well know, the answer to the question, will President Trump raise taxes? That's a fundamental, well, before I actually answer that, you were right. You've asked the right question about how do you pay? How do you pay for the costs that the government has incurred? And some people say that the only way for the government to pay for something is to raise revenue, i.e. raise taxes. However, others say, but there are a variety of ways to raise taxes, including to lower tax rates in order to stimulate the economy and generate higher or more tax revenue. So it becomes kind of a complicated discussion. But if what you mean with the question, would President Trump raise taxes in order to pay for the deficits incurred because of COVID-19, I think that the answer to that is certainly, but would he raise tax rates? Probably not, with the exception of possibly a corporate tax rate of some sort. Corporate tax rate, a discussion about carried interest for investors, for certain investors, and perhaps making sure that we continue with taxation of offshore generated revenue by both individuals and by companies. So I think that raise taxes, yes, because how else do you pay for a deficit? But raise tax rates, I think that the president's answer would be no, with the possible exception of corporate tax rates. Then the second part of your question, which is if there is a recession, how how would the president propose navigating through that? And here again, that is also, as you well know, often defined by party lines, because the argument is often, well, flat out give people lower taxes and more credits because that will stimulate the economy, because individuals will then have more buying power, more disposable income, and a way to stimulate the economy. On the other side of it, there is the discussion of the only way to work our way out of a recession is to raise more revenue on the government level so that the government can reinvest in things like infrastructure, which creates, in and of itself, creates more business for private industry, which then generates additional revenue, which generates additional tax. So, of course, where would the president stand on in this particular area? I believe that the president would stand on the side of the current Republican stance, which is that TCJA, they believe, stimulated the economy when it was enacted, and that while the COVID-19 has produced a significant downturn in our economy, that any further downturn can be compensated by staying the course. That would be the current administration's position. Stay the course with our tax policy. It worked before, it will generate an increase or a surge in the economy again.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate that. I appreciate you using your crystal ball and discussing with us the tax policies that from President Trump for his second term. So thank you to our guest, Karen Brosi, and we hope that we've given you a little bit of information, a few answers, so that you can handle that quick question from your client on what's going to happen after the election. And Karen, I hope we get to talk again after the election and see where we were, and then maybe again next year when we're out on a class together. We could hope.
Well,
we get
and
to
I
do that.
agree that particularly following the election, once we know the outcome, you and I would love to have some conversation with other practitioners about what are the year-end planning pointers that we need to address.
Oh, that's just outstanding.
So thanks, Karen, and thank you for watching out there, our tax prep friends.
Thank you, Sharon and Vern.